They fire me over pants. Not performance. Not misconduct. Not even a policy violation with real teeth. Just pants. Charcoal wool, slim fit, tailored in Houston's Montrose district. I wore them on the day the Department of Defense emailed us directly to say we'd passed the security audit ahead of schedule. I wore them through 16-hour shifts when the system kept throwing red flags no one else could trace. I wore them while cleaning up compliance messes that would have gotten our CEO subpoenaed if I hadn't caught them first. But Valerie, our HR queen with a clipboard full of Pinterest quotes and a vendetta powered by cheap perfume, decided that my slacks sent the wrong message. Something about textile cohesion and team synergy. Whatever that meant. I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. I didn't give her the meltdown she wanted. I just said one thing. I edited the handbook you're quoting. Found 3 grammar errors, by the way. She smiled tight. Brenda, her shadow with bangs and no spine, laughed like it was the best joke she'd heard all year. 2 hours later, I was in room 3C, staring at a final notice with my name on it, printed in red ink like I'd defaulted on a car loan. No discussion. No acknowledgement of my clearance. Just vague phrases like culture misalignment and insubordination. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to understand, was that my badge wasn't just decorative. It was federal, issued by the Defense Security Service, tied directly to encrypted drives, classified files, and real-world missions that didn't care about color-coordinated blazers or pant seams. They hadn't just fired a compliance officer. They'd breached protocol by terminating a cleared federal asset without proper offboarding, which, by the way, automatically triggers a full DSS alert. So while I packed my things into a cardboard box meant for sympathy, the government was already en route. And when the agents in black suits walked through our glass doors, Valerie's face turned pale like she'd seen the ghost of every mistake she'd ever made. That's when I knew. This wasn't over. It had just begun. They didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye. As I stepped into the hallway, clutching that pathetic little cardboard box, half crushed at one corner, like even it couldn't handle the weight of their cowardice, I passed a row of cubicles filled with people pretending they hadn't just witnessed a career execution in slow motion. Heads tilted just enough to look busy, fingers tapping keys with no purpose, eyes darting back to their monitors like guilt could be washed away by another spreadsheet. Miles, my supervisor, had vanished the moment HR called my name. 1 second he was 2 doors down, pretending to fill his coffee cup, and the next he evaporated into a conference room labeled reserved on the company calendar since last Thursday. I didn't blame him. Cowards always know when to duck. They're just bad at admitting why. I didn't say goodbye. Not to the marketing girls who once asked me to fix a printer jam like it required a PhD. Not to the finance bros who wore fleece vests and called every federal audit nerd work. And definitely not to Brenda, who now sat stiffly at her desk, pretending her Slack notification was more important than the walking casualty she helped create. What stung wasn't the termination. It was the silence. Like my name had become radioactive. I passed by the digital wall screen showing the company's quarterly growth curve. Still rising. Still green. Still fake. I remembered staying up until 3 a.m. 3 months ago, rewriting the security compliance documents that made that growth possible. No bonus. No recognition. Just a thank you email that had probably been copy-pasted. I reached the exit lobby. The receptionist, Kayla, fresh out of college and terrified of confrontation, mumbled something about my Cobra packet and final paycheck. She didn't meet my eyes. She slid the envelope across the counter like it might bite. I picked it up without a word, dropped it in the box like trash, and turned to the glass doors. The sunlight outside hit hard, sharp against the sterile lobby air. For a moment, I just stood there, suspended between two worlds, the fluorescent hum of a system that had chewed me up and the electric buzz of the street beyond, chaotic and alive. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the clumsy shuffle of an intern or the click-clack of Valerie's knockoff Louboutins. These were heavier, calibrated, like they belonged to someone used to walking into rooms with authority. I didn't turn at first. You learn not to turn. You wait. You let the moment come to you. And it did. 2 figures entered. 1 man, 1 woman. Matching suits, slim briefcases, no logos. Just posture. The kind of posture you earn, not fake. The man had close-cropped hair and a square jaw, like he'd been born for security briefings. The woman wore a dark bun, so tight it might have been weaponized. She walked a half step ahead of him, scanning the room like she was casing it. They didn't smile, didn't introduce themselves, just walked up to the front desk and said, "We need to speak with Walter Phelps, head of security, and Chad Renner, your CEO." Immediately, reception tried to stall. Agent Torres didn't let her. That was the woman's name. I saw it stitched subtly into her ID badge as she leaned forward. "Not a request," she said. "Not a tone you argue with." I watched all of it from a vinyl chair by the window, the envelope crinkling in my lap, my palms buzzing, not with nerves but recognition. I'd seen this before, in protocol manuals, in case studies we were required to memorize for DSS certification. This was breach response. Someone had tripped the wire. I hadn't even made it out of the building, and they'd already triggered the government's silent alarm. Maybe it was the off-boarding checklist Valerie signed without reading. Maybe someone accessed a restricted shared folder I had partitioned off. Maybe a scheduled system ping for my now deactivated badge had failed and escalated. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the system had noticed. And when DSS notices, people stop hiding behind buzzwords. A few minutes passed like hours. Then the elevator dinged, and everything changed. Chad, the CEO, came barreling down the hallway, tie askew, breath ragged, flanked by Valerie, who looked like she just walked out of a horror film. Her eyes scanned the room, landed on me, then immediately flinched away. For the first time in years, I saw real fear in her expression. Not discomfort, not irritation. Fear. Because for the first time, she didn't have the upper hand. The suits weren't here for a meeting. They were here for the mess. And I was the only one in the building who could still read the instruction manual. From my seat in the corner of the lobby, I watched the storm build behind glass. Agent Torres and her partner, Agent Kaplan, moved like a chess piece 2 turns ahead, silent, surgical, unbothered by the chaos they were stepping into. While the rest of the office fumbled for plausible deniability, they just walked straight through it. The receptionist, now pale and practically vibrating, had abandoned all pretense of protocol and was on the phone with security, voice cracking as she tried to remember the internal escalation chain. Chad and Valerie, my former CEO and the HR queen who had turned wool pants into a corporate felony, were doing everything they could to stay upright. But you could see it already. The shift. Their body language had changed. The performance armor was cracking. Shoulders hunched. Eyes darting. Words clipped at the end like they were being rationed. No one had told them this was coming. That's the thing about arrogance. It makes you deaf to the sound of consequences. The agents asked for a private room. Chad, to his credit, didn't argue. He just motioned limply toward the fishbowl, the conference room with glass walls and the polished wood table no one ever used unless someone was getting fired or funding. The irony made me want to laugh. That room had just hosted my termination an hour ago. Now, it would host something else entirely, an autopsy. The door shut behind them, and for a few moments, the entire office held its breath. You could feel it, a weight pressing on the drywall, on the dropped ceiling tiles, in the fake fern by the copier. People stopped typing. Phones stopped ringing. Even the damn vending machine seemed to fall silent, like the building itself understood something seismic was unfolding beneath the suits and status reports. From my chair, I could see into the fishbowl. Not every word, just flashes, phrases, postures. Valerie spoke first, her lips moving fast, too fast, like she thought if she spoke quickly enough, she could outrun whatever dossier Agent Kaplan had placed on the table. Chad hovered behind her, one hand on the back of a chair like he needed something solid to keep him upright. Then Kaplan opened the folder. Whatever was inside must have been nuclear, because the transformation was instant. Chad's face collapsed. 1 second, he was CEO of a mid-sized defense firm. The next, he was a man watching the first domino fall in a line he hadn't realized was even set up. His mouth dropped slightly. He leaned in, read it again, then leaned back like he'd been struck. Valerie stopped talking. She didn't sit. She didn't argue. She just stood there, frozen, while the 2 federal agents explained what she'd done. And for all the power she had strutted around with, for all the performance reviews she had manipulated, the career she had quietly killed with one line in an HR log. Now she looked like someone realizing she had set a forest fire with a scented candle and a box of matches she didn't understand. I caught a few more words now. Unauthorized personnel, federal asset, classified contract breach. Then Agent Torres raised her voice slightly, not yelling, just enough to puncture through the glass like a scalpel. You terminated a cleared contractor without DSS notification or deactivation protocol. Silence. Then, the death sentence. Your eligibility for the $50 million federal contract is now void. I couldn't see Valerie's face clearly through the refraction in the glass, but I could see her legs give. She dropped into the nearest chair like someone had pulled the cord holding her up. Her clipboard, always attached to her like a security blanket, was gone. And she looked small. Not the kind of small you feel when you've made a mistake. The kind you become when you finally understand how big the mistake really was. Chad stood again, his hands trembling as he pointed to the folder on the table, his voice rising in visible panic. I didn't hear all the words, but I didn't need to. He was begging for workaround. He wanted there to be a clause, a paragraph, a hidden fail-safe buried in the contract that could save his neck. But DSS doesn't play with loopholes. It plays with accountability. And someone had tripped 6 separate protocols with their half-baked firing spree. Outside the room, the office was slowly coming back to life, but in the way a deer blinks after hearing a rifle shot. The marketing team stopped giggling. The interns stopped pretending to refill their water bottles. Slack messages died mid-sentence. Brenda, HR's loyal shadow, was nowhere to be seen. Either she dissolved in her own clipboard or she was under a desk somewhere, trying to delete digital footprints. Then the door to the fishbowl opened. Agent Kaplan stepped out first. Calm, measured. His eyes scanned the room once, then settled directly on me. He gave a nod. Not warm, not cold, just precise. Mr. McConnell, he said, we like a word. I stood slowly, the box still on my lap, my badge zipped in the same leather pouch I'd carried for years without anyone knowing what it actually meant. For a moment, I just let that silence stretch. Let everyone who had watched me walk out like a convict now see me get summoned like a key witness. And I didn't smile. Not yet, because the house wasn't fully on fire, but it had started to smoke. There's a certain silence that falls when you become the person everyone's afraid they just underestimated. As I walked toward the agents, I didn't rush. I didn't adjust my shirt or try to look like I belonged. That's the trick. You don't look like you belong. You walk like you own. And I wasn't putting on a show for the interns craning their necks or the junior execs whispering behind coffee cups. I was walking for one audience, only myself. The man who had spent 6 years building a firewall around this company's biggest secret, only to be shown the door by someone who couldn't spell protocol without a handbook. Agent Kaplan stepped aside and gestured toward the smaller meeting room across from the fishbowl, the one with no glass walls, no prying eyes, just matte walls and a soundproof door. The kind of room designed for HR warnings or impromptu damage control. Today, it would serve as something else. The place where the balance of power would tilt. Inside, Agent Torres was already seated, tablet open, a thin dossier on the table between us. The kind of folder that looked harmless, just paper and ink, but I knew better. If they were here, that file held teeth. It meant the federal government was no longer asking questions. It was starting to document failures. Mr. McConnell, she said, her tone cool, professional, not hostile but not warm either. Thank you for your time. I nodded once, took a seat, and set the envelope with my final paycheck beside me, like a prop in some twisted theater production. Kaplan closed the door and took the seat opposite me. No one said anything for a moment. The kind of pause that's deliberate, meant to unsettle. But I'd done this before. DSS doesn't just deal in security, they deal in rhythm, in the tempo of nerves. You break a subject not with shouting, but with stillness. But I wasn't here to be broken. You understand why we're here? Torres asked, finally. I nodded. I have clearance. They terminated me without protocol. That's a breach. You're here to assess the damage. She exchanged a glance with Kaplan. It was subtle, impressed, Maybe, or just confirmation that I wasn't going to waste their time. Yes, Kaplan said. And to evaluate if the asset he meant me is salvageable in the wake of this mismanagement. I smiled faintly at that. You mean if I still trust the system that just handed me a cardboard box because HR didn't like my pants? Torres didn't smile, but the corner of her lip twitched. Barely. We've reviewed your file, she said, sliding the thin folder forward. Clean. Overqualified. Actually, your encrypted compartmentalization system for Helix Tech's server won a federal audit 6 weeks early. That triggered a quiet elevation. Your digital signature's been monitored by 3 branches. That caught me off guard, but I didn't show it. I'd always suspected, but hearing it out loud? That changed things. You were cleared as a Class C handler, Kaplan added. That's not common for contractors, let alone one in a private sector cubicle farm. I exhaled slow and steady. They didn't know that. HR didn't even know what the black chip embedded in my badge meant. Valerie thought it was just some premium access pass for the data room. Torres closed the folder. We believe you. Silence again. Heavier now, like they were testing the air before handing me a match. We need your help, Kaplan said plainly. Helix Tech's contract is still active, for now. But with this breach, there will be a reassignment. Possibly a full takedown. What we need to know is, was your system the only thing holding this operation together? I didn't answer right away. Not because I didn't know, but because I wanted the weight of the moment to land. The truth is, the entire back end of the Defense Data Transport Framework was built like a spiderweb. Delicate, invisible, and incredibly easy to collapse if you didn't know what string knot to pull. They don't have anyone else with my clearance, I said finally. The guy they promoted last year? He still uses post-it notes to remember his login. The system I designed runs on 3 levels of encrypted cross-checking. You disable one, and the rest lock automatically. Valerie probably thought she was just deactivating a badge. Torres raised an eyebrow, but she shut down a pipeline. Worse, I corrected. She triggered the tripwire, which means Helix Tech is about to fall off the approved contractor list. And they won't even understand why until the emails stop coming. Kaplan leaned back. Then the next step is simple. We make sure you're not buried with them. The offer came not with drama, but with clarity. They didn't need to sell it. The message was implicit. They weren't just offering me a return. They were offering me extraction. Clean, quiet, controlled. Torres pulled out a cream-colored card, slid it across the table. No logo, just a name, a number, and a seal so faint it looked like it had been pressed into the paper by time itself. We'll be in touch, she said. And when we are, we'll talk about what's next. Something better. Something built without people like Valerie in the way. I stared at the card for a long time. Not because I was unsure, but because this was the moment. The shift. The part where a man walks out of the ruins with a key instead of a scar. When I stepped out of that room, everything felt quieter. Not just the hush of corporate dread, the kind that drips from cubicle walls like condensation after a fire alarm, but something deeper. Like the air had shifted. Like everyone in that building could feel that the gravity had just changed direction, even if they didn't yet know which way it was pulling. The hallway was fuller than before. People had stopped pretending to work. Screens glowed unattended. Keyboards lay still. And somewhere in the break room, the coffee machine hissed its last breath like even it understood the curtain was rising on the second act. I passed Brenda first. Her eyes flicked toward me and then away, like she didn't trust what she saw. Her clipboard, the one she clutched like a riot shield, was missing. Without it, she looked like a marionette whose strings had been cut. A few feet ahead, Chad Renner stood in the middle of the lobby, flanked by his executive assistant and what I assumed was the last shred of his composure. His tie had been loosened, not for style, but in the panic tug of a man who thought maybe if he loosened it fast enough, the noose wouldn't tighten. When he saw me, something flickered across his face. Relief? Recognition? Desperation dressed in a smile? Whatever it wasn't confidence. Ethan, he said, stepping forward with the kind of forced enthusiasm normally reserved for alumni donation calls. Could we speak? Just a minute? My office. I didn't answer right away. Just watched him squirm, watched the sweat trickle down his temple in defiance of the central air. I don't work here anymore, I said evenly, voice low but strong enough to carry. You made that clear. The receptionist's typing stopped. Two interns stopped mid-step. Even a ficus looked like it paused to listen. Chad smiled wider, like a man doubling down on a losing hand. Of course, that was premature. Miscommunication, really. Valerie was acting outside her scope, and obviously, your value here is recognized. Let's not let a small misunderstanding ruin a productive relationship. He was spiraling. I tilted my head. You want to talk relationship now? He nodded, eager. I'm prepared to offer full reinstatement. Senior title, 10% raise. No, 15. And we'll put it in writing before close of business today. There it was. The panic offer. A Hail Mary pass thrown too late, too far, after the clock had run out. I looked around, at the room, at the eyes locked on us from behind glass partitions and half-closed doors. They were watching not because of me, but because of him. Because they needed to see what happened when the man at the top realized he'd miscalculated not just once, but catastrophically. I took a breath. Then I smiled. Calm, cold, precise. The salary you can afford, I said slowly, wouldn't cover the therapy required to forget working for you. Dead silence. The kind of silence that hums in your ears. That echoes. That spreads like wildfire across a Slack thread. Chad opened his mouth, probably to beg, maybe to threaten, but he was already too late. The agents were back. Agent Torres stepped forward, her heels clicking with the authority Chad had faked for years. She nodded once in my direction. Mr. McConnell, if you're ready, we'll finish the debriefing downtown. Her voice was calm, measured, but every syllable held weight, like punctuation marks carved in steel. I turned to her. Of course, I said, adjusting the strap of my bag. Let's talk. As I walked toward the elevator flanked by the agents, I didn't look back. Not because I didn't want to see their faces, but because I already had. I'd seen them when they fired me. Smug, confident, dismissive. And I'd seen them now. Pale, cornered, gasping for control they no longer held. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't gloating. It was clarity. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped in, let them close behind me with a hiss of finality, and felt something inside me shift. Not a wound closing, but a page turning. I wasn't just leaving Helix Tech. I was walking out of the wreckage. And they? They were still inside, picking up the pieces of a $50 million contract shattered by a bad judgment call and a dress code email with too many emojis. It started quietly, like all real collapses do. There was no explosion, no alarms, no dramatic meltdown, just silence, tight and suffocating, that settled over the office like a chemical fog, invisible but unmistakable. That's how you know the infrastructure is cracking, when people stop speaking in full sentences and start whispering with their eyes. By the time the elevator doors had closed behind me, the infection had already spread. Not a digital virus, not a hardware failure, but something worse, uncertainty. The kind that eats through a company's core faster than malware ever could. The kind that lives in the space between a Slack ping and the absence of a reply. In the delayed loading of a shared drive. In the blinking cursor that won't turn into a sentence because the person typing it isn't sure who's in charge anymore. I didn't see it firsthand, but I knew. Because that's what happens when you remove the keystone from a structure that was already top-heavy with arrogance. It doesn't explode. It buckles. One soft bend at a time. I was told later, by a friend still inside, one of the quiet ones who kept their head down and their mouth shut, that the systems began freezing mid-afternoon. First, it was the clearance logs, then the internal access dashboards, then the classification filters that determined which files could even be seen, let alone edited. All of it had been routed, at some point in the past year, through a custom encryption protocol I had built. Not because I was showing off, not even because I wanted control, but because I had to. The old system was a Frankenstein patchwork of plugins and unsecured cloud-based forms. We were handling classified data like we were a damn wedding planning firm. So I fixed it. Quietly. Efficiently. Thoroughly. And no one asked what would happen if I left. No one thought that maybe, just maybe, the guy who held the digital master key might matter more than his waistline or the texture of his trousers. until he was gone. And then, reality arrived like a thunderclap no one heard coming. By 3:15 p.m., according to internal logs I later reviewed unofficially, the DSS had initiated a full-scale systems audit. Not a review, an audit. Every piece of data tagged with federal clearance was now under surveillance. The agents weren't just observing, they were interrogating the infrastructure. And Helix Tech, for all its slick branding and half-baked org charts, wasn't prepared. The first major hit came when a junior project manager, probably Maggie, Valerie's golden intern, tried to override the access panel to the secure project portal, the one marked Omega Vault on our systems. That portal was tied to a biometric fallback I'd configured with DSS oversight. It required one of 3 cleared fingerprints to open. Mine was one. The other 2 were placeholders the agency hadn't even activated yet. The portal rejected her attempt. Then it locked. Then it sent an alert. That's when the second wave hit. The alert triggered an internal firewall escalation, which routed every classified system through a quarantine protocol. That meant anything marked CUI, IDAR, or restricted became untouchable. Documents vanished from desktops. Spreadsheets collapsed into blank cells. Engineers were frozen out mid-edit. Teams screamed at each other over Zoom. Each side convinced the other had changed permissions. They hadn't. The system had changed itself, because it had been designed that way. Not to punish, to protect. And once DSS confirmed the integrity breach, the real knife dropped. By 4 p.m., Helix Tech was officially placed on the contractor suspension list. That's not a warning. That's a guillotine. It meant the $50 million deal wasn't just delayed. It was void. Funds halted. Communications frozen. All future federal partnerships paused, pending investigation. And in room 3C, where I'd been terminated hours earlier, someone was probably trying to explain to a federal agent why Valerie Hastings had signed my deactivation paperwork without running it through the offboarding encryption tool that I had built and only I knew how to bypass. That's when the panic started leaking into the carpet. Valerie, I was told, left the building around 4:30, face pale, makeup streaked, escorted not by security, but by Agent Kaplan. Word spread fast. She'd been flagged as the breach point. Her access badge was disabled before she even hit the parking lot. Chad, still trying to save face, at least on the surface. But the board had already been notified. His call stopped getting returned. Legal was looped in. And when the CFO saw the word federal breach, she left the office early for a dentist appointment and never came back. From my vantage point, seated in the back of a black SUV heading toward the federal field office, the DSS card still warm in my palm, it all felt inevitable. Not satisfying, not victorious, just inevitable. Because when you let incompetence rise and let loyalty rot, this is what happens. When you trade substance for image, process for politics, truth for posture, eventually someone pulls the wrong thread and the whole damn thing unravels. They thought I was just another nameplate, another quiet compliance guy in off-the-rack slacks. They forgot I was the only person in the building who knew where the landmines were buried. And worse, they stepped on one. By the time I arrived at the DSS field office, the building was humming like a server farm at full load, quiet on the surface, but every molecule inside charged with heat and urgency. The walls were matte gray, windowless, like the entire place had been designed by someone who distrusted both sunlight and decoration. No receptionist, no lobby music, no water cooler chatter. Just air that smelled like sealed documents and metal filings. Agent Torres led the way down a hallway that could have doubled as a bunker. Agent Kaplan followed behind, silent as ever. No small talk, no easing into what came next. They knew what I knew, that when a breach happens at this level, words stop matching unless they're being typed into a federal report. They took me to a small conference room. No table, just 3 chairs and a wall-mounted screen displaying the Helix Tech logo, still spinning, still loading. That was a nice touch. Psychological warfare at its most elegant. Torres sat first, crossed one leg over the other, and opened a slim laptop. "Ethan," she said, dropping the formality like a jacket. "Before we go further, I want to make something clear. You are not under review. You're not being investigated. You are, frankly, the only person who handled this situation with protocol awareness. Kaplan nodded beside her. That said, we'll need full cooperation. From this point forward, everything you disclose will be recorded. Any omissions will be treated as procedural gaps. You understand? I gave a slight nod. I've worked with DSS long enough to know the script. Torres allowed herself half a smile. Good. Then let's talk about what they broke. What followed was an hour-long debrief that felt less like a conversation and more like postmortem surgery. I walked them through the encryption layers I had coded into the Helix Tech compliance vault. The dynamic keys, the biometric tethering, the time lockouts. I showed them how I had designed the system not for convenience, but for containment, because I never trusted the people in that building to take protocol seriously unless it physically stopped them from screwing it up. Kaplan's eyebrows arched more than once. Torres's fingers flew across the keyboard like someone recording a confession with national security implications. When I mentioned that Valerie had once insisted on unifying the file structure by asking me to upload audit-sensitive spreadsheets to a cloud-based team drive, Torres actually stopped typing and just stared at me. She said what? She asked, her tone flat, her eyes sharpening. She wanted everything to feel collaborative, I said. Didn't like that certain folders had access gates. Said it created silos. Kaplan muttered something under his breath. Probably a curse. Or a prayer. We kept going. I mapped out where the triggers were buried. Automated protocols that sent system alerts to a backchannel inbox if someone without clearance tried to execute a classified action. I told them how I'd routed those signals through a third-party mirror to avoid detection by the internal IT team, who, at Valerie's request, had started randomly disabling user monitoring tools. By the time we were done, the shape of the story had changed. I wasn't a terminated compliance officer anymore. I was a whistleblower with receipts, and a critical systems architect whose exit had blown the lid off a dangerous culture of aesthetic management and procedural neglect. Torres closed her laptop slowly, then looked up at me like she was measuring my weight in something heavier than trust. They're done, she said simply. The system logs alone would have triggered a partial suspension. But your documentation, your build architecture, that audit trail, that's a career killer. For all of them. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. Valerie's credentials were already revoked this morning, Kaplan added. We've tagged her as the origin point of the chain breach. She'll be lucky to land a job at a car rental desk after this. And Chad, I asked, not because I cared, but because I knew the answer would be the final nail. Torres exhaled. The board's been informed. He'll be removed quietly, likely under the guise of health or new opportunities. But internally, he's toxic. No clearance renewal. No federal contracts for any company he touches. I leaned back in the chair. The air suddenly felt colder. Not because I was chilled, but because they were. That's the thing about watching power fall apart. It's never explosive. It's surgical, quiet, clinical. People imagine collapses as chaos and shouting and thrown chairs. But in real life, it's an inbox that stops pinging. A badge that doesn't beep at the turnstile. A name that vanishes from the company directory overnight. And just like that, the world shifts. The balance resets. Not with applause. With deletion. Torres slid the cream-colored business card across the table again. The one she'd given me before. I picked it up, turned it between my fingers. We'll contact you next week, she said. We'll discuss placement options. We subcontract oversight roles. And frankly, we'd rather work with someone who knows the difference between protocol and policy theater. I nodded, not because I needed it, but because it was mine to accept or decline. As I walked out of the room, Agent Kaplan held the door open for me. It wasn't a favor. It was respect. Not the kind you ask for. The kind you earn. Outside, the air had changed. The city felt cleaner somehow. Not because Houston had lost its grit, but because I had walked out of the storm with no ash on my skin. They burned themselves. I had simply held the match. It didn't hit me until I saw the skyline. Houston stretched out across the windshield like a memory too large to fold. The sun was just starting to dip behind the concrete spires and glass towers, washing the city in that golden hour haze that makes even strip malls look cinematic. Cars drifted past me in a blur, People going to dinner, home, their gyms, their happy hours, living in a world untouched by what had just happened behind federal doors. And that's when it landed. I wasn't going back. Not to the building. Not to the title. Not to the desk with the cracked monitor and the cactus I'd managed to keep alive despite Brenda's well-meaning attempts to drown it every other week. There would be no reinstatement, no cleaning out of my office, no final meeting with HR where someone handed me a sealed envelope and apologized without making eye contact. That chapter was gone. Burned. Redacted. Locked in a federal cabinet somewhere under fluorescent lights and non-disclosure agreements. And strangely, I didn't feel relief, or triumph, or even closure. I felt clarity, because for the first time in years, I wasn't tethered to anything I had to explain away. No more pretending I didn't hear the laughter in the hallway when I walked past. No more smiling politely when someone asked if I'd consider freshening up the wardrobe to feel more in sync with the culture. No more calculating the emotional temperature of a meeting before offering a correction that might bruise someone's paper-thin ego. I was no longer managing optics. I was managing impact. As I drove toward home, though that word suddenly felt insufficient, I let the past few years unspool in my mind like a film I hadn't realized was playing on loop. The missed promotions, the meetings I led that were credited to someone else, the Friday emails at 4:59 p.m. asking for one quick compliance review before Monday morning, as if I lived in a drawer and could be summoned on demand. And through it all, I had stayed. Why? Because I thought doing the job right would eventually be enough. That if I kept my head down and let my work speak louder than the noise, someone would notice. Someone good. Someone who gave a damn about more than quarterly reports and color-coded team synergy. But no one did. Not until the day they fired me. And that's the cruel, cosmic joke of it. The moment I was removed is the exact moment I became essential. Not because I changed, but because I finally stopped protecting them from themselves. When I got home, the lights were off, the air quiet. I didn't turn on music, didn't pour a drink. I just stood in the entryway for a minute, letting the silence wash over me like an exhale I'd been holding for too many years. Then I walked to the closet, pulled out the slim black pouch, and placed my DSS badge back inside it, deliberately, respectfully, like one would return a weapon to its holster after a necessary fight. It didn't need to be on display. It never did. Its power didn't come from being seen. It came from being understood by the right people. And now, the right people had seen it. On the kitchen counter, I laid down the card Torres had given me. No title, no logo, just her name, a number, and that embossed seal that said everything without saying a word. I didn't call her. Not yet. Because this wasn't a rescue. It was an invitation. And I wasn't going to accept it from place of reaction. I was going to accept it when I was ready, when I knew exactly what kind of impact I wanted to make next. There was no going back to the Ethan who swallowed frustration in polite emails, who sat through diversity trainings led by the least diverse minds in the building, who had to explain basic government acronyms to people who thought DSS was a file type. No, that Ethan was gone. Not bitter, not broken, just done. I had spent years making systems bulletproof for people who didn't read the manual. And now, for the first time, I would get to build something where every single person in the room knew what they were doing. Where clearance wasn't just a badge, it was a language. And I was fluent. The offer didn't come in a manila envelope or a bulletproof SUV. It didn't arrive with urgency or theater. There was no second knock on the door, no courier in sunglasses, no encrypted briefcase handcuffed to a wrist. It came on a Wednesday, mid-morning, via a plain text email from a.gov address that wouldn't mean anything to most people. No subject line, no signature block, just a sentence, clinical in tone and deliberate in weight. Available for coffee Thursday at 9 o'clock. Location, Montrose Station. Neutral ground. That was it. No explanation, no attachment, no threat, no seduction, just a quiet request from a powerful place. I didn't reply immediately. I let it sit for 5 minutes. Not because I was unsure, but because timing matters in the world I was now circling. Respond too fast, and you look eager. Respond too slow, and you look uncertain. 5 minutes was the sweet spot, enough to show I was in control, but not enough to seem detached. Confirmed. Black, no sugar. Send. Then I closed the laptop and went about my day. A new rhythm had taken hold of my hours. No more standing meetings. No more random calls from HR asking for my availability as if I had none of my own. No more performance reviews framed in PowerPoint slides, dripping with words like alignment and culture fit, as if those phrases were actual metrics and not just verbal wallpaper. Now, time felt like currency, and I was finally holding the pen that signed the checks. When Thursday came, I arrived early. The Montrose Station Cafe was quiet, tucked beneath a second-story awning with mismatched patio chairs and a barista who looked like he moonlighted as a philosophy major. I chose a corner seat, one with full view of the entrance, back to the wall, habit hard-coded from years of watching systems fall apart from the inside. At 8:59 a.m., she arrived. Agent Torres. But she wasn't her standard DSS charcoal. She wore a muted navy blazer, jeans, and low heels that didn't click when she walked. Civilian armor. Her hair was down this time, sharp waves still controlled, but softer somehow. She moved with that same silent command, like the sidewalk made space for her without being asked. She ordered coffee, black, and took the seat across from me without ceremony. We didn't shake hands, not because of hostility, but because in our world, everything already starts at full disclosure. There's no need to pretend. I appreciate the punctuality, she said. I appreciate the discretion, I replied. She nodded once, like that was the answer she expected. I'll be direct, she said, wrapping her fingers around the cup. We want you back in the system, but not as a cog. I didn't blink. Go on. We've identified a structural vulnerability, she continued. One that repeats across agencies, vendors, and subcontractors. Oversight has become theater. Protocol exists on paper, but dies in implementation. We need people who can build from the inside, who can embed compliance as infrastructure, not as performance. And you think that's me? Torres didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pulled a single piece of paper from her bag, folded once, cream-colored, standard DSS paper, thick, fibrous, slightly coarse to the touch. She slid it across the table. I unfolded it slowly. At the top, no header, no logo, just one word, consultant. Underneath, a clearance classification I hadn't seen outside of military black site documentation. A number that didn't represent salary, but access level. Embedded at the bottom, a line item of pre-cleared travel locations and embedded project codes tied to ongoing federal infrastructure. It wasn't a job. It was an invitation into the core. I won't dress this up, Torres said, her voice quiet. It won't be comfortable. The people you report to won't always agree with you. You'll be in rooms where your silence matters more than your opinion. But when you speak, what you say will change policy. I folded the paper back, methodically, letting the weight of it settle in my hands. And the pay? I asked. She smiled, not widely, but with confidence. It's not compensation you'll need. It's agency. She stood to leave, but paused beside my chair, placing a small flash drive on the table. Matte black, unmarked. Call me after you open it, she said. But only if your answer is yes. Then she walked away. No goodbye. No handshake. Just the deliberate steps of someone who never leave a room unsure of the outcome. I sat there for another 10 minutes, staring at that flash drive. I knew what was on it. Not numbers. Not documents. Blueprints. The skeletons of the next system I'd be asked to build. Maybe even fix. Maybe even burn if it came to that. And right there, in the buzz of a coffee shop that served lattes in cracked ceramic mugs, I felt something I hadn't in years. Not fear. Not pride. Not revenge. Purpose. There's a moment just before you agree to something irreversible when the world slows down. Not like a movie where everything fades to slow-motion glory, but like a hard drive on the brink of failure, spinning just slow enough for you to hear the hum of its decline. I plugged in a flash drive that evening. No password prompt. No splash screen. Just a single folder labeled Phoenix. Inside, documents, audit logs, architecture charts, redacted emails that bled with desperation, and 3 video files, recorded testimonies from anonymous sources, faces blurred, voices flattened by digital filters but still steeped in panic. The company was called Stratagem Dynamics, Another mid-tier defense contractor with a glossy brand and rotting infrastructure. Different logo, same story. A leadership team obsessed with quarterly optics, a compliance division gutted for agility, and an internal culture that punished silence less than it punished truth. In one video, a former cybersecurity engineer explained how an unauthorized VPN tunnel had been running for 6 months before anyone noticed. In another, a project lead confessed they'd signed off on a falsified security compliance report just to make deadline. And in the third, this one hit different. A young woman, maybe 28, maybe 30, looked directly into the camera and said, "I flagged it. Twice. They told me to stay in my lane. So I quit. I figured if the building was going to burn, I didn't want to be the one holding the extinguisher while they sold matches." I closed the laptop. Sat there for a long time. The room was dark except for the hum of the ceiling fan and the blue light of the monitor fading to sleep. On the desk beside me, Torres's card. Beneath that, the cream-colored offer sheet with the word consultant sitting at the top like a crown made of quiet knives. This wasn't a job. It was an entry point. A blank page. A seat at the table with no tablecloth to hide the stains. The next morning, I made the call. Torres answered on the second ring. "I take it you've seen the file," she said. No pleasantries, no warm-up. "I have," I said. "You want me to fix it?" She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different texture. Not command, not formality. Something quieter, but deeper, respect. "We want you to decide if it's worth fixing at all." That was new. I'd spent my whole career inside systems built by other people, patching leaks and structures I didn't design, reinforcing bad frameworks because someone higher up had already approved the budget. I had always been the fail-safe, the emergency brake, the guy who made unworkable plans look functional for just long enough to protect the brand. But now, they were giving me something more dangerous than access. Autonomy. The assignment started with an unmarked building just outside Austin. Strategem's regional headquarters sat behind a manicured parking lot and 2 layers of reinforced glass. From the outside, it looked like a tech startup trying to cosplay as the Pentagon, color-coded key cards, innovation quotes on the walls, digital check-in kiosks manned by interns with neckbeards and barely repressed anxiety. Inside, I was greeted by a liaison, middle manager type, overly eager, hand extended before I even stepped through security. "Mr. McConnell," he said, "welcome to Strategem. We're honored to have you on board." I didn't return the smile. "You're not honored. You're audited. Let's skip the fiction." That shut him up. He walked me to the executive floor, saying little, sweating a lot. I noticed the walls were lined with motivational posters. One literally read, "Compliance is confidence," in Comic Sans. I made a mental note to request that one be burned first. The conference room was already full. 8 people, each one radiating fear disguised as curiosity. The VP of Operations, the CTO, 2 legal advisors, and across the table, Strategem CEO, a man named Daryl Kessler. Thick-rimmed glasses, designer shoes, hair that had clearly seen more product than protocol. He stood when I entered, extended a hand. "Ethan, right? We're excited to turn a new page." I look him in the eye. The page isn't turning. The book's on fire. And just like that, the tone was set. Over the next 90 minutes, I asked questions. Not polite ones. Not the kind that start with, "Can you walk me through?" or "Would you mind explaining?" I asked surgical questions. Where are the backups stored? Who cleared the 0-day patch without timestamp validation? Why is access to the live server routed through a machine that hasn't had firmware updated since 2018? No one answered fast. Some didn't answer at all. But that was fine. I wasn't there for their answers. I was there to decide if they deserved to keep the system at all. When the meeting ended, Kessler asked if I'd send a summary report for leadership. I told him no. "I don't write reports," I said. "I write rewrites. And if you're lucky, I'll leave you with a system instead of a crater." And then I left the room. Because that's the difference now. I don't work for men like him anymore. I work for something cleaner. And if the manual doesn't serve the mission, I burn it. The first time I saw a compliance manual, I was 23, fresh out of grad school, still believing that rules were written by people who deserved to write them. The cover was plain, government-issued, too thin to inspire confidence, too thick to skim. Inside were words like integrity, chain of custody, fail-safe protocols. Phrases I took seriously because back then I thought everyone else did too. I didn't understand yet that the manual was just a costume, a disguise for power pretending to be order. Years later, sitting in a temporary workspace inside Stratagem's data command hub, I flipped through their version of the same document. Flashier fonts, color-coded tabs, a foreword from the CEO that read like it had been written by a PR intern on Adderall. Every section ended with a quote from some TED Talk about innovation and synergy. None of it meant a damn thing, because when things fell apart, and they always did, no one grabbed the manual. They grabbed people like me. Now, I didn't even get to do that. I chose if I'd show up. I chose how I'd show up. And more importantly, I chose what survived. The system at Stratagem was rotten all the way through. The audit logs proved it. Access trails that didn't align. Devices that hadn't been authenticated in years. User accounts tied to employees who had long since quit or been fired. There were files that no one could even explain, duplicates of sensitive documents uploaded at odd hours, from IP addresses that bounced through 5 cities in under 2 minutes. Either they had been breached, or someone had been playing fast and loose with access keys. Probably both. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was the complacency. The way senior leadership sat in meetings pretending to care while texting each other under the table. The way junior engineers whispered the truth in stairwells but clammed up the second HR stepped in. The way their legal team asked more about plausible deniability than actual compliance. This wasn't a company in crisis. This was a company allergic to accountability. So I did what I was brought in to do. I tore the damn thing down. Not with drama, not with threats, but with facts, silence, and the surgical removal of access. One by one, I revoked credentials. I escalated audits. I flagged inconsistencies in their vendor contracts that triggered automatic DHS review. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I didn't write dramatic emails. I just flipped the switches they forgot existed. By the end of the week, their entire project pipeline was frozen. By the end of the second, 3 board members had resigned voluntarily. By the third, Kessler was gone, escorted out through the back loading dock with a cardboard box and a non-compete clause that now meant nothing. That was the moment I realized something had fundamentally shifted, not just in them, but in me. I didn't feel vengeance. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt alignment. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't at war with the people around me. I was the war, disguised as the solution. One morning, after the dust had mostly settled, I walked into what was now my office. Modest, clean, glass walls, no motivational posters, and found a new envelope on the desk. Inside, a note and signed. What you burn needed burning. What you build next, make sure it scares the right people. I knew the handwriting. Torres. The DSS didn't micromanage. They observed, quietly, intently, and when you proved yourself, they didn't just assign you tasks. They entrusted you with fire. That afternoon, I met with the new leadership team. They asked if I could review the rebuilt compliance architecture. I told them to scrap it. We followed federal guidelines. One of them protested. So did the Titanic, I replied. But it still sank. They were quiet after that. Sometimes silence is the most honest answer you'll get from a system that's been lying to itself for years. By the end of the quarter, Stratagem was back in good standing. Clean infrastructure, leaner teams, and a new policy manual I'd rewritten from scratch. 40 pages shorter, 3 times as effective, and absolutely terrifying to anyone who ever weaponized ambiguity for personal gain. The final page had no text, just a seal, and a reminder that in this world, you're either enforcing the system or being used by it. Now I enforce it, on my terms, with no apologies, because when the smoke clears and the ash settles, and the white-collar architects of disaster scurry off to their next quarterly report, I'm still standing, not in the spotlight, not on a stage, but just outside the door, holding the blueprint, the access key, and, when necessary, the match. If you've ever been underestimated, sidelined, or silenced by people who mistook authority for competence, remember this. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it walks away quietly, holding the fuse. If stories like this hit close to home, subscribe. Because sooner or later, The system forgets who it depends on, and when it does, we'll be right here, telling the stories they tried to bury.